The dust rose in billowing clouds as the stagecoach rattled to a stop outside Coolidge, Arizona Territory, in the scorching summer of 1883. Josephine Jones clutched her threadbare carpetbag, her knuckles white with anxiety. The journey from Boston had been long and grueling, but nothing compared to the uncertainty that lay ahead. She had answered an advertisement for a position as housekeeper to a rancher, a desperate measure after her father's passing had left her destitute and alone. As Josephine stepped down from the coach, the arid heat hit her like a physical blow. Her fashionable Eastern dress, with its high collar and multiple petticoats, suddenly seemed ridiculous in this harsh landscape. Sweat beaded on her brow as she looked around the small frontier settlement, hoping to spot the man who had agreed to employ her. "Miss Jones." A deep voice called from her right. She turned to see a tall figure approaching, silhouetted against the blazing afternoon sun. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, casting shadows across his face. As he drew closer, she could make out weathered features, sun-bronzed skin, and eyes the color of a summer storm. "I'm Caleb Zimmerman," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy that seemed incongruous with his rugged appearance. "Welcome to Coolidge." Josephine nodded politely, trying to hide her apprehension. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Zimmerman." He took her carpetbag without asking, hoisting it effortlessly. "My ranch is about 5 miles outside town, horses tied up over there." He nodded toward a hitching post where a magnificent chestnut stallion stood waiting, both of us on one horse. Josephine couldn't keep the alarm from her voice. The hint of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "Unless you'd prefer to walk in this heat, Miss Jones." The ride to the ranch was uncomfortable, not just because of their close proximity, but because every mile took Josephine further from everything familiar. The landscape stretched endlessly, dotted with scrubby vegetation and occasional rock formations that rose dramatically against the cloudless sky. "It's beautiful," she murmured, surprising herself with the admission. "It grows on you," Caleb replied, his voice rumbling against her back. The ranch appeared suddenly a modest but well-maintained house, a large barn, several corrals, and outbuildings. A windmill creaked lazily in the afternoon breeze, drawing water from the depths of the earth. "It's not much compared to what you're used to in Boston," Caleb said as he helped her dismount, his strong hands gripping her waist momentarily. "It's quite impressive," Josephine replied honestly. A ranch like this represented substantial success in such unforgiving territory. Inside, the house was unexpectedly comfortable. Simple furnishings, clean floors, and curtains at the windows gave it a sense of home that Josephine hadn't anticipated. "Your room is through there," Caleb gestured to a door off the main living area. "I'll show you the kitchen." "You can start with supper tonight." Panic fluttered in Josephine's chest. She had never mentioned cooking in her letters, focusing instead on her skills in cleaning and organization. The kitchen, when Caleb led her into it, looked alien. A large cast iron stove dominated one wall, pots and pans hung from hooks, and unfamiliar implements were arranged on shelves. "Mr. Zimmerman," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I should be honest with you. I don't know how to cook," she admitted, bracing herself for his anger or disappointment. But the cowboy merely studied her for a long moment before saying, "I'll teach you what my mother taught me." His unexpected response stunned Josephine into silence. She had anticipated being sent away immediately, forced to return to Boston in disgrace or seek employment elsewhere in this unfamiliar territory. "You're not upset," she ventured. "Would be a waste of energy," he replied pragmatically. "Besides, everyone starts somewhere. My mother was the finest cook in the territory, and she made sure I learned my way around a kitchen before she passed." Relief washed over Josephine. "I'm a quick learner, Mr. Zimmerman." "Caleb," he corrected. "Out here, formality doesn't last long. Now, let's start with something simple." That first evening, Caleb taught her how to make a basic stew, chopping vegetables, browning meat, adding the right blend of seasonings. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he demonstrated each step, and Josephine found herself watching his face more than his technique. There was a gentleness in his expression that belied his rough exterior. The stew wasn't perfect, the meat was a bit tough, the carrots undercooked, but Caleb ate it without complaint. "Better than my first attempt," he said, offering a rare smile that transformed his face. In the days that followed, Josephine settled into a routine. Mornings were spent cleaning the house and learning to prepare simple meals under Caleb's tutelage. Afternoons, she tackled the mending that had accumulated. Caleb's shirts and jeans showed the wear of hard ranch work. After a week, she found the courage to ask about the rest of the ranch hands. "Surely you don't run this entire operation alone?" Caleb looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. "Got 3 men who help with the cattle. They've got a bunkhouse closer to the north pasture. They come by when needed, but mostly keep to themselves. And before me, who managed the house?" A shadow crossed his face. "Did it myself since Mother passed 2 years ago. Eventually realized I was doing a poor job of it." The admission seemed to cost him something, and Josephine felt a sudden tenderness toward this proud, solitary man who had opened his home to a stranger. As summer blazed on, Josephine's cooking improved steadily under Caleb's patient instruction. From biscuits to roasts, from preserves to pies, she gradually mastered the skills that had been second nature to frontier women for generations. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Josephine said, "Your mother must have been quite a woman." "She was," Caleb agreed, his voice softening with memory. "Came out here with my father when there was nothing but wilderness. Built this place alongside him, never complained even when times were hard. What happened to your father? Apache raid 15 years ago. I was 16. Mother and I carried on." The simple statement contained worlds of pain and resilience. Josephine's hand moved instinctively to cover his where it rested on the arm of his chair. For a heartbeat, he allowed the contact before gently withdrawing. "It was a different time," he said. "The relations with the Apache are more peaceful now. Old Chief Strongbow comes by sometimes." He and father had a respect for each other, despite everything. As July turned to August, Josephine began to feel a sense of belonging she had never experienced in Boston. There, she had been the dutiful daughter, then the poor relation dependent on distant family's charity. Here, her work mattered. She was building something, contributing to the ranch's success in tangible ways. Caleb noticed her growing confidence. "You've taken to frontier life better than I expected," he remarked one morning as she efficiently kneaded dough for the day's bread. "I find I prefer it to city living," she replied. "There's an honesty here that Boston lacked." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, and Josephine felt a fluttering sensation in her chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of bread making. The first crisis came in late August. Josephine had ventured farther from the house than usual, gathering wild herbs that Caleb had shown her could add flavor to their meals. Absorbed in her task, she didn't notice the changing weather until the sky darkened ominously overhead. Desert storms moved with frightening speed. By the time Josephine started back toward the ranch, the wind had risen to a howl, whipping sand and debris into stinging projectiles. Disoriented, she took a wrong turn, ending up in an unfamiliar ravine just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, water was rushing through the previously dry streambed. Josephine scrambled to higher ground, but the rain-slicked rocks offered treacherous footing. As she slipped, a strong hand caught her arm, yanking her upward to safety. "What in God's name were you thinking?" Caleb's voice was harsh with fear as he pulled her onto his horse. "These washes flood in seconds during a storm." "I'm sorry," Josephine gasped, clinging to him as he urged the horse up the steep bank. "I lost track of time." The ride back to the ranch was harrowing, rain lashing them as thunder crashed overhead. By the time they reached the house, both were drenched to the skin and shivering. Inside, Caleb built up the fire while Josephine changed into dry clothes. When she emerged from her room, he handed her a cup containing a generous measure of whiskey. "Drink it," he ordered. "It'll ward off the chill." She obeyed, coughing as the liquor burned its way down her throat. Caleb watched her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "I thought," he began, then stopped, his jaw tightening. "Don't wander off like that again, not without telling me where you're going." The concern behind his gruff words touched Josephine deeply. "I won't," she promised, "and thank you for finding me." "I know every inch of this land," he said simply, "and I take care of what's mine." The possessive statement hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Josephine felt her cheeks warm and she looked away, focusing on the dancing flames in the fireplace. That night marked a shift in their relationship. The careful distance Caleb had maintained began to erode, replaced by something more attentive, more protective. He took to teaching her about the land itself, how to read weather signs, identify landmarks, navigate by the stars. These lessons often came during walks in the cool of the evening, when the day's work was done and the desert came alive with nocturnal creatures. "My father called this the breathing time," Caleb told her as they watched a family of coyotes trot purposefully across a distant ridge. "When the land exhales after the heat of day." "It's beautiful," Josephine said, not for the first time. The wild majesty of Arizona had captured her heart completely. "It can kill you if you don't respect it," Caleb reminded her, but his tone was gentle. Beauty and danger all mixed together. September brought the cattle drive a chaotic time when the ranch hands moved temporarily into the bunkhouse, and Josephine found herself cooking for a crew of hungry men. Caleb spent long days in the saddle, returning exhausted each evening. "You don't have to wait up," he told her on the third night, finding her still at the kitchen table despite the late hour. "I wanted to make sure you ate something," she replied, placing a plate of reheated stew before him. He studied her face in the lamplight. "You're tired too." "It's satisfying work," she said with a smile. "I feel useful here." "You're more than useful, Josephine." The rare use of her given name sent a pleasant shiver through her. "You've brought life back to this house." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of feelings that had been growing steadily over the summer months. The moment was broken by a commotion outside, shouts, and the sound of running feet. Caleb was on his feet instantly, reaching for the rifle kept near the door. "Stay inside," he ordered, his expression hardening as he stepped out into the darkness. Josephine moved to the window, straining to see what was happening. Lanterns bobbed in the yard, illuminating a cluster of men around something or someone on the ground. Unable to contain her concern, she grabbed a shawl and hurried outside. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Tommy, lay writhing on the ground, his face contorted in pain. "Snake got him," explained Marcus, the oldest of the hands. "Rattler by the look of the bite." Caleb was already examining the angry puncture wounds on Tommy's calf, his expression grim. "Get him inside," he directed. "Josephine, I need hot water, clean cloths, and the whiskey." The next hours were a blur of activity as they fought to save the young cowboy's life. Caleb cut into the wound, encouraging it to bleed freely, while Josephine bathed Tommy's fevered face and helped him drink water mixed with willow bark tea for the pain. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Tommy slept fitfully on a pallet in the main room, his color improved, the swelling in his leg beginning to subside. "You did well," Caleb told Josephine as they stepped outside to watch the sunrise. "Not everyone could have handled that." "I've nursed before," she said. "My father was ill for many months before he passed." Caleb nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life and death are closer out here. You face them directly." "I prefer that to the polite fictions of Boston society," Josephine admitted. "There, my father's illness was something shameful to be hidden away." "Nothing shameful about living or dying," Caleb said. "Only in how you do either." The cattle drive concluded successfully a week later, with the herd delivered to the railroad for transport east. The payment Caleb received would see the ranch through the winter and allow for improvements he'd been planning. "I'm thinking of expanding the house," he told Josephine one evening in early October. "Adding a proper dining room, maybe another bedroom." "It would make entertaining easier," she agreed, "when the neighbors visit." Though such occasions were rare, given the distances between ranches, Caleb looked at her steadily. "I wasn't thinking about neighbors." The implication of his words that he was planning for a future that included her, perhaps in a different capacity than housekeeper, sent a rush of warmth through Josephine. Before she could respond, hoofbeats in the yard announced a visitor, an unusual occurrence, especially as dusk approached. Caleb rose, his hand instinctively checking the revolver at his hip before he went to the door. The visitor proved to be a messenger from town, bearing a telegram for Josephine. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her mind racing with possibilities, mostly troubling ones, as telegrams rarely brought good news. The message was brief but devastating. Her cousin Edward, who had managed what little remained of her father's estate, had embezzled the funds and fled to Canada. There would be no quarterly allowance forthcoming, and in fact, there were debts that technically fell to her. "Bad news?" Caleb asked, noting her pallor. Wordlessly, she handed him the telegram. His expression darkened as he read it. "This cousin of yours, he was supposed to be sending you money. A small allowance from what remained after my father's debts were settled," Josephine explained. "It wasn't much, but it was something of my own. Now it seems there's nothing worse than nothing." "You have a place here," Caleb said firmly. "This changes nothing." But it did change things, and both knew it. The small independence Josephine had maintained was gone. She was now entirely dependent on Caleb's generosity. That night, she lay awake long after the house fell silent, considering her options. She could seek other employment, perhaps in town as a shop girl or teacher. She could write to distant relatives in Philadelphia, though that prospect held little appeal after how she had been treated following her father's death. Or she could stay, accepting a new kind of dependency that frightened her with its implications, not because she feared Caleb, but because she feared the depth of her own feelings for him. The next morning, Josephine rose early, determined to speak with Caleb before her courage failed. She found him on the porch, watching the sun rise over the eastern mountains. "I need to speak with you," she began formally. "About the telegram?" he asked, turning to face her. "Yes, I want you to know that I don't expect you to continue my employment out of charity." "I understand that, Josephine," he interrupted, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Do you want to leave?" The direct question caught her off guard. "I know, but I can't bear to be a burden." "You've never been that," he said, stepping closer. "From the day you arrived, you've contributed more to this ranch than you know." "As your housekeeper," she clarified, needing to understand precisely where they stood. Caleb's eyes held her steadily. "Is that all you want to be?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with months of unspoken feelings, shared meals, and gradual discoveries. "No," Josephine whispered, finding unexpected courage in his direct gaze. "It's not." Caleb closed the distance between them, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I've been waiting to hear you say that." Their first kiss was tentative, a question-and-answer exchange that quickly deepened into something more certain. When they finally parted, Josephine felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, a recognition of home that had nothing to do with buildings or geography. "I should have spoken sooner," Caleb said, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "But I wanted to be sure you were choosing this life, not just accepting it for lack of options." "I chose it long before yesterday's telegram," Josephine assured him. "I just didn't know how to tell you." The weeks that followed were filled with a new kind of learning, the careful discovery of each other, beyond their established roles. Caleb proved to be as patient a teacher in matters of the heart as he had been in the kitchen, never pushing Josephine beyond her comfort, but always encouraging her to explore her own desires. Their courtship was unconventional by Eastern standards. Instead of chaperoned walks and formal dinners, there were shared work and quiet conversations under star-filled skies. Caleb taught Josephine to ride properly, gifting her with a gentle mare that soon became her devoted companion on explorations of the ranch's more distant reaches. In turn, Josephine brought a feminine touch to the ranch house that had been missing since Caleb's mother passed. Curtains she sewed from ordered fabric, carefully tended houseplants, and eventually a small garden protected from the harsh sun by a cleverly constructed arbor, all transformed the house into a true home. The neighboring ranchers and townspeople noticed the change in Caleb. The taciturn cowboy smiled more readily, participated more actively in community affairs, and spoke of the future with an optimism that had been absent for years. "When are you going to make it official?" Marcus asked bluntly one evening as the men sat smoking on the porch after dinner. Caleb shot him a warning look, But Josephine, overhearing as she cleared the table, felt a flutter of anticipation rather than embarrassment. The question had been in her mind as well. That night, as they walked beneath a sky ablaze with stars, Caleb seemed preoccupied. Just as Josephine was about to ask what troubled him, he stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "I'm not a man of fancy words," he began, his voice gruff with emotion. "But I know what I want, and that's you beside me for the rest of our days." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the moonlight, a ring of twisted silver strands that formed an intricate knot. "My father made this for my mother when they first settled here," he explained. Said it represented how their lives were woven together, stronger for the joining. Tears welled in Josephine's eyes as Caleb took her hand. "Josephine Jones, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, Caleb." The ring slid onto her finger as if made for her, and when Caleb gathered her into his arms, Josephine felt the rightness of their union down to her very soul. They were married on a crisp November morning in the small church in Coolidge. The entire community turned out for the occasion, ranchers and their families, shopkeepers from town, even a delegation from the nearby Apache settlement, led by old Chief Strongbow who had known Caleb's father. Josephine wore a dress of ivory silk ordered from a catalog and carefully altered to fit her slender frame. Wildflowers gathered that morning formed her bouquet, their vibrant colors a testament to the desert's hidden bounty. Caleb, almost unrecognizable in a new suit, watched her walk toward him with an expression of such naked adoration that several of the women present dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with feasting, dancing, and the kind of genuine goodwill that frontier communities excelled at generating. When the newlyweds finally retired to the ranch house, now truly their home together, both were exhausted but radiantly happy. "Mrs. Zimmerman," Caleb murmured as he carried her across the threshold, "has a fine sound to it." Josephine laughed, her arms twined around his neck. "Indeed it does, Mr. Zimmerman." Their wedding night was a revelation to Josephine. Caleb's tenderness, his careful attention to her pleasure, and the profound connection she felt as they joined together surpassed anything she had imagined. In the aftermath, lying in his arms as the first light of dawn crept through the window, she felt a contentment so deep it bordered on spiritual. "I never thought I could be this happy," she confessed, her head pillowed on his chest. Caleb's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Nor did I. After Mother died, I thought this house would never feel like home again. And now it's the only place I want to be so long as you're in it." Winter in Arizona brought cooler temperatures but little snow to their elevation. Christmas approached, and Josephine threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm, determined to create new traditions for their first holiday as a married couple. She baked cookies using recipes Caleb remembered from his childhood, fashioned decorations from pine cones and ribbons, and even convinced Caleb to ride out with her to find a suitable small pine to bring indoors. "Mother would have liked you," Caleb told her as they decorated the tree on Christmas Eve. "She valued practical skills but never lost her appreciation for beauty." "I wish I could have known her," Josephine said sincerely, "though I feel I do in a way through her cooking and through you." On Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts, a hand-tooled leather journal for Josephine, a finely knitted scarf for Caleb. But their greatest gift to each other came in the form of an announcement. "I have something to tell you," Josephine said as they sat before the fire after dinner. "Something wonderful." Caleb looked at her expectantly, his eyes warming with interest. "I'm with child," she said, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat abdomen. "Our child." For a moment, Caleb sat perfectly still, as if absorbing the magnitude of her words. Then he was on his knees before her, his hands covering hers, his eyes suspiciously bright. "When?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "The doctor in town says June or thereabouts." She smiled, covering his hand with hers where it rested on her stomach. "He says everything appears perfectly normal." Caleb pressed his lips to her forehead, then her lips. "A child," he murmured against her skin. "Our child." The months of Josephine's pregnancy passed in a blend of anticipation and practical preparation. Caleb converted the small room off their bedroom into a nursery, crafting a cradle from pine with his own hands. Josephine sewed tiny garments, each stitch a testament to her love for the life growing within her. The ranch prospered that year. Spring rains were plentiful, new calves were healthy and numerous, and Caleb's careful management began to show results in increased profits. He hired an additional hand to help with the heavier work, insisting that Josephine rest more as her condition advanced, not that she was idle. Her garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables for their table. She continued to cook, though now Caleb often insisted on helping, particularly when recipes required long periods of standing. Their evenings were spent in quiet companionship, reading aloud to each other, planning for the future, or simply sitting in contented silence on the porch as the desert night enfolded them. In early June, just as the doctor had predicted, Josephine went into labor. The birth was difficult, lasting through a day and night of Arizona heat that seemed to intensify with each passing hour. Caleb remained nearby throughout, his worry evident in the lines etched around his eyes, though he tried to hide it for Josephine's sake. Dawn was breaking when their son finally arrived, announcing his presence with a robust cry that brought tears of joy to both parents' eyes. They named him Christopher James Zimmerman, Christopher for Caleb's father, James for Josephine's. "He has your eyes," Josephine murmured as she cradled their newborn son, exhausted but radiant. "And your determination," Caleb replied with a gentle smile, "the way he fought to enter this world." The first months of Christopher's life transformed the rhythm of the ranch. Josephine's days now revolved around feeding schedules and the precious nap times when she could attend to other tasks. Caleb adjusted his work patterns to be more present, often taking the baby with him on short rides around the property, securely cradled against his chest. "He should know this land from the beginning," Caleb explained. "Feel it become part of him as it is part of us." By Christopher's first birthday, he was taking his first wobbling steps across the porch, his chubby hands reaching trustingly for whichever parent was nearest. The celebration was a small but joyful affair, with the ranch hands and a few neighbors joining them for a picnic under the cottonwood trees near the creek. As Josephine watched her husband swing their laughing son up onto his shoulders, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years earlier, she had been a sheltered Boston girl with no practical skills and few prospects. Now she was a rancher's wife, a mother, a woman who could cook a meal for a dozen hungry cowboys, tend a garden in the desert, and even ride out alone to check on straying cattle if the need arose. Life in Arizona wasn't easy. There were still dangers: flash floods, venomous creatures, occasional tensions with less peaceful Native American groups, the constant uncertainty of weather and its impact on the ranch's success. But these challenges were faced together, with a partnership that grew stronger through each trial. That evening, after Christopher had been tucked into his crib, Caleb and Josephine stood together on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I was thinking," Caleb said, his arm around her waist, "about expanding again. The ranch, I mean." "Oh." Josephine leaned into his solid warmth. "Marcus mentioned that the Hendricks place might be for sale. Old man Hendricks is thinking of moving back east to live with his daughter. That's the property that borders our north pasture, isn't it, with the good water access?" Caleb nodded, pleased but not surprised by her knowledge of the surrounding lands. "Would mean more cattle, more hands to manage, more work all around. But also more security for our future," Josephine observed. "For Christopher's future. That's my thinking." Caleb turned to face her, his expression serious. "But it would mean changes for you too, more men to feed, more household to manage." Josephine smiled, reaching up to touch his weather-lined face. "I think I can handle that, Mr. Zimmerman. After all, I had an excellent teacher in the kitchen." Caleb laughed, pulling her closer. "That you did, Mrs. Zimmerman, and you've surpassed your teacher in many ways." "Never," she protested. "Your biscuits are still lighter than mine." "Perhaps," he conceded, "but your venison stew would make angels weep." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant howl of coyotes a familiar soundtrack to the desert night. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked suddenly. "Coming west," taking a chance on a rough cowboy who couldn't even keep his own house in order. Josephine considered the question seriously, knowing he deserved an honest answer. I've never regretted it, not even in those first difficult days when I burned the biscuits and shrunk your shirts. I didn't mind the shirts, he said with a grin. I know what I left behind, she continued. A life of genteel poverty, of dependence on reluctant relatives, of rigid social constraints that valued appearance over substance. She gestured toward the darkened landscape, the ranch buildings silvered by moonlight. What I found here was freedom, hard work, yes, but work with purpose. And you, a man who saw value in me beyond my social graces or family connections. I saw a woman brave enough to travel across the country alone, honest enough to admit what she didn't know, and determined enough to learn, Caleb said, his voice deepening with emotion. How could I not fall in love with that woman? Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. And I fell in love with a man who taught me to cook instead of dismissing me, who showed me this beautiful, harsh land through his eyes, who built a home strong enough to withstand whatever storms might come. Their kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of the bond that had grown between them, a bond forged through shared work, shared dreams, and the family they had created together. The following years brought both challenges and joys. The ranch expanded as planned, with the acquisition of the Hendricks property adding significant grazing land and water rights. A daughter, Elizabeth Ann, joined the family 2 years after Christopher's birth, a fierce, independent girl from her first breath, with her mother's delicate features and her father's determined spirit. Coolidge itself grew as well, with the railroad bringing increased commerce and new settlers. Josephine became a respected figure in the community, often called upon to help with births, illnesses, or the inevitable accidents of frontier life. Her kitchen skills, once non-existent, became legendary, her preserves and baked goods winning ribbons at the territorial fair 3 years running. Caleb served briefly on the town council, lending his practical wisdom to decisions about water management and relations with the Apache communities. But his heart remained on the ranch, in the daily work of building something lasting for his children. By the time Christopher was 10 and Elizabeth 8, the Zimmerman Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the territory. The house had been expanded twice more, now boasting a proper dining room that could accommodate 20 at holiday gatherings, a dedicated office for ranch business, and bedrooms enough for the children to have their own spaces as they grew. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Caleb surprised Josephine with a trip to San Francisco, her first journey beyond Arizona since her arrival. They spent 2 glorious weeks exploring the cosmopolitan city, attending the theater, dining in fine restaurants, and walking along the bay. Do you miss it? Caleb asked as they prepared to return home. City life with all its conveniences and culture, Josephine considered the question as she packed away the new books and small luxuries she had purchased. I appreciate visiting, she said honestly. But home is Coolidge, our ranch, our children, the life we've built together. Caleb's smile was tender as he drew her into his arms. I feel the same, though I wouldn't mind bringing a bit more culture to our corner of the territory, perhaps music lessons for Elizabeth. She has a fine singing voice. And Christopher shows a talent for drawing, Josephine agreed. We could arrange for proper instruction next time the children accompany us to Phoenix. This blend of frontier practicality and cultural aspiration characterized their approach to raising their children. Christopher and Elizabeth grew up with strong values: hard work, honesty, respect for the land and its diverse peoples, but also with exposure to education and arts that Josephine and Caleb had accessed only as adults. As the 19th century drew to a close, Arizona stood on the threshold of statehood, and the Zimmerman Ranch had become an institution in the region. The original modest house remained at its heart, though now surrounded by additions that reflected the family's growth and prosperity. On a warm evening in the summer of 1900, Josephine stood in her kitchen, far more modern now, with a new cast iron range and actual ice delivered weekly from town, preparing a special dinner to celebrate Christopher's acceptance to a university in California. Need any help? Caleb asked, coming in from settling the horses for the night. You could chop those onions, she suggested, gesturing to the board she had prepared. Just the way you taught me all those years ago. Caleb washed his hands at the sink, another modern addition he had installed to make her work easier, and took up the knife with familiar skill. Hard to believe it's been 17 years since you stepped off that stage, Coach. Looking terrified and completely out of place, Josephine added with a laugh. Looking beautiful and brave, he corrected, his eyes warm with memory. The best thing that ever happened to this ranch. The best thing that ever happened to me was admitting I couldn't cook, Josephine replied, her smile tender as she moved to his side. And finding a cowboy willing to teach me what his mother taught him. Together they prepared the meal, moving around each other with the easy synchronization of long partnership. Outside, the sun set over the western mountains, bathing their home in golden light, a fitting benediction on a life built through love, labor, and the courage to begin anew in an unfamiliar land.